Chris Wilson, estratega digital de la campaña de Ted Cruz, encuestador y estratega político. Se desempeñó como director global de investigación para Weber Chadwick de 1999 al 2001. Inició su propia firma, WPA Intelligence, en 1998. Ha diseñado y registrado diversas metodologías de investigación que incluyen el mapeo de mensajes y la investigación de mejora en donativos a las campañas. Ex instructor de investigación de políticas públicas en la Kennedy School of Government de la Universidad de Harvard. Participa regularmente como comentarista en MSNBC, Fox News Channel, CNN y C-SPAN. Ha sido citado en publicaciones nacionales como el Washington Post, el Washington Times, el New York Times y el Wall Street Journal.
Thank you for that. I apologize in advance that my Spanish is so bad that if I tried to speak in it, I wouldn't get anything out that was intelligible. So I have no idea what was just said about me in the introduction, but hopefully it will make you stick around. I'm sure like many of you who work in politics, you struggle to tell people what you do for a living. And in fact, I have two boys who joke that I don't actually have a job. So as I sit next to people on airplanes, depending on whether I want to talk to them or not about what I do, I usually describe what I do as anything from an economist to a data scientist to, or I act like I'm deaf. But my kids, whenever we were pulling up to Walmart to go shopping a couple weeks ago, there was a sign out front that said it was help wanted, and I thought I could use that as a teaching experience for them. And I said, well, my son who jokes that I have no job outside of, or don't have a job, he said, hey, Dad, maybe you could get a job at Walmart. And I thought, oh, this is a teaching moment. So I said, well, Carson, do you think they'd hire data scientists? To which he responded back to me, oh, Dad, they'll hire anybody. So I don't know that I've done a good job yet of explaining what I do, but hopefully I can do a decent job of explaining a little bit about data and its use in campaigns. To go through some of the history of campaigning and the use of data and analytics, which is what I've devoted my career to, there's really been an evolution going back to 1890 when William Jennings Bryan first completed a rudimentary database of alphabetical index cards that he used to characterize different personality traits and different leanings of supporters. Then you go into the mid-20th century, the rise of television caused targeting, appealing to through a unique medium, and the ability or the desire to try and track that. And so George Gallup began applying polling to campaigning, and then so that was really the increase in data. And then in the 1980s, Republicans really kind of took the lead on using direct mail for fundraising, but building lists and appending data to try and do a better job of understanding who might respond rather than just sending a mail piece or a solicitation to everybody. And that was really the beginning of keeping political lists and databases. So we went from that into the 1990s. And, oops, sorry, went too far there. There, the 1990s. There we go. Looked at the wrong one. So in the 1990s, voter targeting was really based on a few different segments, usually utilizing a shade, and you may have heard about it. It was called Claritas, and the thing on the bottom kind of brings back bad memories for you. You probably dealt with these. But from a targeting perspective, it was at best 1 to 3 different demographic characteristics and a maximum of up to 3 different layers combined. And then in 2004, any of you saw this are probably having flashbacks right now. You had what was referred to as micro-targeting. It was developed during the Bush campaign, and initially they called it a super segmentation. So if any of you who are familiar with the statistical segmentation, that's what this was. And it brought about a more sophisticated segmentation of the electorate in what at the beginning was the beginning of the digital age, but it still only allowed up to really about 20 different segments, which you can kind of see down the left-hand side there. And a single micro-targeting survey, and to give you a better idea of what it looked like, was so expensive, it was about $100,000 to do, and it would only be applied, and that would be state by state. So if you want to do all 50 states in the United States, you're talking millions of dollars. And so really only a presidential campaign could do it. And even at that point, you still were only dealing with percentages and not real numbers. So you move from that into the Obama campaign. And they were really the first campaign to bring modern predictive analytics into politics. And I have a lot of respect for the guy who had the role in the Obama campaign that I did in the Cruz campaign. It's a guy named Dan Porter who's become a friend of mine. And listening to the evolution of what they were able to do and collecting massive amounts of data and using that to build and maintain dynamic models that they were able to adjust everything from their mail to their media buys to even advertisements on buses, on bus routes. And then moving forward into 2012, you would think Republicans would have caught up, right? They saw what happened in 2008. But the Obama campaign had 50 data scientists housed in Chicago, and comparatively, the Romney campaign had 6. So that goes through really an overall evolution. I want to talk about kind of my evolution and what we've done here and my world in this. The first predictive model I built was for a guy named Mike Lee, who was an attorney in Salt Lake City, Utah, who wanted to run against an incumbent United States senator. It was at the beginning of what's been called the Tea Party movement in the U.S. And to build this first model, we had, and you can see down underneath it, it mentions around 200 pieces of first, second, and third-party data appended to a good voter file. And to build that model, it took us a week to run. Everybody had to stay off email because we had it hosted locally on our server. And in doing that, we built a model of who we wanted to recruit to come out to a caucus. And long story short, he became a United States Senator. The next time we did it was 2 years later for a lawyer from Houston, Texas, who happened to be a friend of Mike Lee's, a guy named Ted Cruz. And we modeled where voters were going to turn out and how to go about targeting them, and also where we could find new voters that would turn out and vote for somebody like Ted Cruz. At that point, we were dealing with about 400 pieces of first, second, and third-party data appends on a well-appended voter file. 2 years later, a guy who was Attorney General of Texas was looking at running for governor. And in Texas, there's no contribution limits. So if you're running for state office, so we had a lot of money and was able to spend it. And we had a well-appended file, had about 800 pieces of first, second, and third-party data. So you can think of the growth there, 200, 400, 800. And from that, then it led into what we did in 2016. I'm going to show you a video here in a second for Ted Cruz on the presidential campaign. And a well-appended file there with none of our data, just purchasing third-party, second-party, and then what we might have a little bit of first-party canvassing data that we went into the campaign with. And a well-appended voter file, which would be about 90% of the voters in the United States, would have up to and in excess of 5,000 pieces of data per file. So the ability to model over 30 million Republican primary voters, which is what we worked with, into ideological segments, issue clusters, personality types, supporters, and then also to be able to understand how to suppress third-party choices led to a lot of the success we had in that campaign. So John Stossel, who is a reporter with Fox News, did a piece on that I'm going to show you, and it's got, unlike me, it'll have Spanish subtitles.
This year's election is different because every campaign now makes use of more digital data. The Washington Post says Ted Cruz, despite spending less on ads than his opponents, has had more success because he uses big data. So what is that? Well, it's what helped President Obama get elected. Liberal techies found new ways to target individual voters. And now Cruz's campaign says we're doing that and more. And they showed it to us.
Ted Cruz for president, how may I help you?
We followed Cruz campaign workers in Iowa and Texas to see how they use the new technology.
You're going to see the political team get real stressed in the next few days. A lot of us have used campaign data throughout our careers, but to really truly invest our campaign into the daily use of that is very difficult to do because often data is incongruent with your instincts.
Jeff Rowe, Cruz's campaign manager, no longer trusts his political instinct. Now his team wants data.
There's been times, even in the past couple of weeks, where we've had like a gut instinct on something that we thought, hey, we should go do this. But, we have the patience now to wait a day, day and a half till we get some data on it to see if it's actually effective.
It used to be politicians used to sit in the back of a car and wave to people on the parade route. Now, they get out of the car, shake their hand, put a piece of candy in the kid's hand so the mother and father warm up to the candidate to speak.
And now his team goes further. They try to figure out which of those people might like Cruz.
That allows us to take out all the noise, not have to jump out of the car and go start shaking hands on the road, to use that example, but actually get out of the car, walk to one person who on this parade route will be able to be motivated, and then use the precise language and method to communicate to them. Ted Cruz says what he's going to say wherever he goes. Not a syllable that changes at all. Not a joke that changes, unfortunately, for those that hear him repeatedly.
I spent most of last week in Washington, D.C., so it is great to be back in America.
And not any stories that change. What it changes is our application, our ability to attract crowds for him.
Big data tells him where Cruz should campaign.
It is impossible for me to send him to the wrong congressional district in Tennessee. I would have to override so many systems to send him to the wrong town in Tennessee with the data analytics that we have. So when you say how has data impacted the campaign, it's turned it on its head.
The Romney campaign had data analytics too, but Rose says they hardly used it.
The Mitt Romney campaign is you spent north of $50 million on data and data analytics, and they asked one of the senior strategists, what did you do with that data? He said, oh, we didn't use it for what we were doing. They didn't use it in advertising, they didn't use it in communication, they didn't use it on the ground. It's like buying a brand new car and not driving it. Obama won because he was essentially unopposed. He scored a touchdown, but the other team wasn't even on the field. Now Republicans have decided, finally, to participate there, and now we are dominating digital media.
Many people say that's why Cruz won in Iowa.
All kinds of data analytics is clearly helping him tonight.
Just a year ago, Republicans won the Senate, and yet the way we're campaigning already this cycle is exponentially greater in terms of advancement and reliance on digital or data.
To save volunteers time, the Cruz campaign focuses only on potentially sympathetic voters. They figure that out by buying consumer marketing data from businesses. Once they know what magazines you buy, things you like on Facebook, they can predict your politics. They researched me.
So that actually, from a candidate preference model, he would be a key Cruz target. My speculation is he leans a little bit more libertarian.
Yes, no kidding.
He's more open to freedom.
I don't like Cruz's eagerness to bomb.
We will carpet bomb them into oblivion.
His anger at illegal immigrants, his support for the drug war. So Wilson might not have his volunteers spend time talking to me. On the other hand,
there's one group of people that vote 65% plus Republicans, people who go to church more than once a week. They really don't live together. So you have to go find those people.
Ted Cruz found those people in Iowa and got them to show up at caucuses. Campaign volunteers like Carol made that happen, but they had to learn new things.
I'm, of the old school, dial the number and talk and write things down on paper.
No Moores is the campaign's research director.
Every single person on here is identified in terms of how we're going to reach them, number of times we're going to touch them through television, direct mail, online, over the telephone.
If I can learn this, anybody can.
What, some candidates say no, don't use data?
There is a bit of a lack of understanding of it. Don't know what you're going to do. You're going to go scare people because they think that we're being intrusive.
I believe others have data. I'm sure you can go to other campaign offices and talk to them, but they will not have it as baked into their campaign plan as we do, where we can't operate without it.
The data tells volunteers which arguments to make with each voter.
I wanted to call you to tell you about Ted's position on Barack Obama's executive orders on immigration.
The phone screen gives volunteers a script.
Now that you know where Ted stands on amnesty, can I tell him that you're going to vote for him on caucus
The volunteer
night?
pushes buttons based on the voter's answer. Technology in the phone sends that information back to this man's computer.
Saves me about 2 to 3 hours a night.
It saves door-to-door campaigners even more time.
It shows every voter in the household, and it shows which voter we want to talk to.
So the volunteers visit those voters only.
Can Ted count on your support at the caucus?
They're the people who, if we can get them motivated, make them believe it's worth their time.
Call them up in the morning, drive them to the polls?
Whatever it takes. We'll go to their house. We'll bug them until they either turn out to vote or get a restraining order against us.
They don't actually go that far, but they do now devote almost all their energy to that sliver of sympathetic voters and then do whatever they can to get them to vote.
So let me wrap up with kind of 2016 and then go into the future from there. But I do think there's been a lot of coverage of the Clinton campaign and the idea that there was an over-reliance of data. And I do believe that they may have that over-reliance and the fact that they spent so much money and ran so many models. For instance, they employed dozens of data scientists. In fact, at one point, they had an ad on a website called Craggle that people like me hang out on and work with data for fun. in which they were trying to hire 1,000 data scientists. I don't think a Washington hedge or a New York hedge fund could hire that many, but they ran 6 times as many simulations on a day-to-day basis as what Obama did. And I think that led to too much faith in the data. And that's probably one of the reasons why they were surprised in a lot of the states where they ended up. And the important thing is it's got to work together, data and survey research. So I'll talk about that and kind of where we go from here, and then some of the applicability to it in other countries where we've done work as well that hopefully will be helpful. So first of all, I just want to say that data has become exponentially, sorry, I keep thinking I'm hitting the wrong one here. Go back to that. Data has become exponentially entrenched in everybody's lives. Thank you. And the number of messages, just to give you some examples, on Twitter grows at about 200% a year. And in 2017, it exceeded 500 million tweets a day, or 200 billion tweets per year. There's over 1.86 million active Facebook users. It's a 17% increase year over year. In fact, Facebook is actually looking at putting drones over Africa to broadcast internet access because they've reached the point that they can no longer grow without expanding their audience into those universes. And YouTube, there's 900 million users of YouTube, Google's YouTube service. And there's over an hour of video uploaded every second. There's 1.3 billion viewers. So think about this for a second to put it in perspective. Of all the data stored in the world today, only 2% is non-digital. The rest of it is online. So really, global information access is the new normal. And by the end of 2016, internet traffic reached 1.2 zettabytes, and by 2021, it'll hit 3.3 zettabytes per year. And again, further perspective, that's the equivalent of streaming the entire Netflix catalog 3,177 times. If it was printed in books, it would layer the U.S. 104 layers thick. In the 3rd century, interestingly, Ptolemy II of Egypt tried to store a copy of every single written work in the world at that point in the Library of Alexandria. Some of all the knowledge. Well, if you think to the digital deluge that exists today, sweeping the globe, it's the equivalent of giving every person, living person, 320 times as much information that was stored in that original library. But I will say, with information, as with physics, size matters. And where we go from there and what we do with it matters. People are becoming more than just connected. They're becoming hyper-connected. To give you a few examples, Google is able to identify the outbreak of the flu faster than the U.S. Centers for Disease Control using real-time searches of symptoms. Power companies are able to double the consumption capacity and last year squeezed more than $2 billion out of a company's existing asset simply by smartly rerouting power at the right time to the right places. It's what saved Florida and Texas whenever they were hit by hurricanes in situations that would have destroyed certain communities just a couple of years ago. And patient monitoring. This is for rural areas all over the world is becoming absolutely vital. Doctors are able to use wrist monitors, Apple Watches in some cases, connected to the machines that allow real-time reactions to save lives, in which they can actually have an ambulance going to someone's house before that person actually gets sick. And I do a lot of work for gaming companies. And believe it or not, slot machines are now being wired to computers in which they are also wired to people. They give people little tech watches. If you've been to Disneyland or anything like that, you've probably gotten a similar one, in which they can actually predict whether or not you're going to be happy or unhappy before you get the result, and it can adjust that result to make sure that you keep playing. So the fragmentation and how this works for politics and the fragmentation of viewing patterns as well is becoming a big deal, because where people got their news and their information, I think, changes how we as political practitioners have got to target people. What that chart shows you is just that from an overall standpoint of how people watch TV and where they got it, the bottom line is that people are shifting to getting their news through online. And I'm sure everyone heard about the fake news epidemic in the U.S. last year. It wasn't as much of an epidemic as it was kind of a movement that people that happened. But having said that, it was the modeling and optimizing an organization's reach in cyberspace, and analytics allows you to find hard-to-find viewers. And this is, just to give one example of that, in the U.S., we built out, this is something after the presidential campaign, I got really bored, so I just started building models for the fun of it. And I thought I'd go look and see where cord cutters were. And those are people who get all their television or their viewing from Netflix or Hulu or Apple TV or services like that. And what we found was in some states, fully a third of the universe had moved from cable or satellite and moved to an online viewership, which made it very difficult to reach people without having a digital strategy. And that's another aspect that I want to point out in the general election campaign. Somebody asked me earlier if I was going to talk about the Trump campaign, and I had zero involvement with that. After the Cruz campaign, I was really kind of done with 2016. But I do think one of the brilliance of Brad Parscale, who was the digital director of the Trump campaign, was that he knew what he didn't know. He didn't go into a presidential campaign as a practitioner from the corporate world thinking he knew everything about politics. And in fact, his approach was very similar as if he was running a corporate campaign. And he actually ended up spending half of their overall budget on digital communications. To put that in perspective, in the past, usually about 5 to 10% of the U.S. is spent on digital budgets. International campaigns I've done have ranged anywhere from 5 on the low side to 20 on the high side. On the Cruz campaign, we spent about a third of our budget on digital, and we thought that was excessive. So, as I hope I've made clear, really big data is changing everything. It's the amount of data available and the insight has a lot of benefits to it, but it changes the way the world thinks and operates. It changes what was augmented or replaced by computer systems. A couple of examples of what's coming in the future is the McDonald's CEO said the other day that he predicts that by 2020, 2021, robots are going to replace people in the service industry. The auto industry's investment in driverless cars has become a big deal. And real-time targeting, where companies have access to data as quickly as it is created while simultaneously leveraging machine learning or artificial intelligence functionality to plan for the future. It's kind of what happens when you go on to Google or Netflix now. But let me go into 3 important aspects of what data is and what it isn't that I think are probably one of the most important notes I'd give. It's about predictions. And that's an important aspect to understand. It is not about knowing about decisions. It's about predictions itself. And then you as the practitioner have to be able to analyze that. Jeff Rowe had said earlier about that we couldn't override systems. To some extent that was true, but to some it wasn't. We still had to have a gut reaction to it. By using data, you can predict everything from cereals that people eat in the morning to a stock someone's going to invest in or should invest in. And you can use it to model behavior, model trends of both individuals and universes to create a probability of future events. So how do we use it moving forward? Well, it's not about trying to teach a computer to think like humans. And that's, I was actually in my room earlier watching hearings on Capitol Hill in which senators were trying to describe artificial intelligence, and I added this line because I think there's so much confusion about AI and how it works. But instead, it's about taking these large quantities of data and inferring probabilities from that. The probability of whether a person will vote for us, what influences their vote, and ultimately, hopefully, who they will vote for. It's also the future of technology. And from a standpoint of understanding how that affects, there are 3 important trends that I think have got to govern every aspect of what we do with big data. The first one is, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with survey sampling. And really, as we analyze and have access to so much more data, the need for sampling goes away. It was a phenomenon that was necessary when we couldn't canvass. But now we can ingest all of the data available, and sampling goes away. As we look at all of this additional data, it also permits us to loosen up our desire for exactitude. You know, in survey research, you do 1,000 interviews, you have a margin of error of 3.2%. You give up that margin of error for a predictive model that is 90% in terms of its exactitude. And it's a trade-off. With less error from sampling, we can accept more measurement error. When the ability to measure is limited, we had to count only the most important things, and you strove to get to that exact number. Third is a move away from the age-old search for causality. How often did you hear someone say, well, it's correlation but not causation? Now I would respond, who cares? The causality is kind of a quaint aspect that you can, if you get caught up on why something occurs, what the cause of it is, I find, particularly as people make electoral decisions, you miss very important trends. And so my training as a statistician, a mathematician, kept bringing me back to that search for causality, into which finally at one point I had to say, who cares? Moving on beyond it. So how, from a campaign standpoint, can you adjust all this and reach a diverse base? And so I'll show you an example of a platform that we started to build on the presidential campaign that we now use for our larger clients. In Texas, there are 15.5 million registered voters. There will be somewhere between 5 and 6 million votes cast in November, in which two of my very important clients, Governor Abbott, Senator Cruz, are both up for re-election. So we are tracking on a daily basis how many of those people we touch. We've drilled down even further. We know in Texas there are 2,068,746 voters that would not turn out and vote in 2018. But if they do vote, would vote for my clients, vote for the Republicans that are up. So that's who we're talking to. And what you see represented there in the graph, on the left-hand side, how many we've talked to. The green voters are for us. The red line are those who are against us. And then on the right-hand side are the campaign staffers and how many people they've touched. So we're able to monitor down to that level. It's actually updated every single night. And then every other piece of data from the campaign is also ingested into the system. So on an ongoing basis, we're able to monitor what is developing and how things are moving. Now, that's its positive uses, I would say, in politics. There's also overlaying data and the understanding that big data sets do not exist alone. This happened a couple of weeks ago. You probably heard about it in the news, in which Strava, which is it's like a biking exercise monitoring. I've got it on my watch, and a lot of people will use it even as they ski. But they released a lot of data. What that allowed people to do was overlay Google Maps with public satellite imagery, and from that match it up to locations in the United States, but also in Afghanistan and Iraq, and locate U.S. military bases. So it's important to understand that sometimes the release of data and the use of data can have other consequences. So as I kind of move into some international aspects of this, I want to talk, just kind of, again, put in perspective what happens today in an internet minute. And I won't read through everything up there, but in a minute, 3.5 million individual searches are conducted on Google. We can now match that against a voter file and help use that to enrich our models. 156 million emails are sent. That's not counting spam. Those are real emails. 900,000 logins on Facebook. 4.1 million videos viewed on YouTube. 452,000 tweets sit on Twitter. 342,000 apps are downloaded. And 990,000 swipes, either left or right, on Tinder. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about some international work. But first, I'm going to show you another video that kind of goes through how 2016 wrapped up for us and some other things we do. I apologize that some of this is repetitive from the last one, but it's a lot shorter. So hopefully it'll give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the other things that we have used data for as we move into some of our international work.
In Iowa, a presidential campaign was on the line.
The Iowa caucuses are 1 week from tonight, and the latest CBS News Battleground Tracker poll shows Donald Trump is 5 points ahead of Ted Cruz, who led in the same poll just a month ago.
A tough race in Wisconsin meant control of Capitol Hill was up for grabs.
The Senate, it's really on a razor's edge.
The new Marquette Law School poll has former Senator Russ Feingold leading Ron Johnson 50-37. That's a 13-point margin.
And despite long odds and a $1 billion price tag, one American city wanted to bring an NFL franchise to town.
Governor Brian Sandoval announcing he will call a special session next week. Among the topics, public funding for an NFL stadium right here in Las Vegas that could be home to the Raiders.
Iowa, Wisconsin, the Raiders in Las Vegas. These may have looked like lost causes, But when a campaign has data and knows how to use it, you can get the right support from the right people.
The Washington Post says Ted Cruz, despite spending less on ads than his opponents, has had more success because he uses big data.
I would have to override so many systems to send him to the wrong town in Tennessee with the data analytics that we have. So when you say how has data impacted the campaign, it's turned it on its head.
Every single person on here is identified in terms of number of times we're going to touch them through television, direct mail, online, over the telephone.
Using data the right way can turn the tides.
Senator Johnson trailing Russ Feingold by 4.7%. Feingold was way ahead, so this thing's narrowed quite a bit.
Using data the right way can change the game.
State lawmakers are moving the chains once again on the proposed $1.9 billion NFL stadium. The funding measure is being handed off to the Nevada Assembly after clearing the Senate earlier tonight.
Most important, using data the right way can help you win. This is what the future of data analytics and research looks like. Traditional polling as a standalone predictor does not provide the intelligence you need to win.
Ted Cruz, the Republican senator from Texas, will win the Iowa caucuses.
The last 13 polls out of Iowa show Donald Trump leading here.
Fox has called the race for Ron Johnson. This race initially leaning heavily Democratic.
How did polling get this so wrong?
After months of debate, we are a giant step closer to seeing an NFL team take the field called the Las Vegas Raiders.
There's a reason that cycle after cycle, in good years and bad, WPA intelligence campaigns outperformed the GOP by an average of more than 20 points.
What, some candidates say no, don't use data?
There is a bit of a lack of understanding of it.
So I wanted to go through that just because I think there are a couple of things that are useful. The first one before I go to Australia, now I'm probably going to try and play it again. But whenever the Wisconsin example is an interesting one because when we built that cord cutter map that I showed you earlier, it was, I didn't know what I'd find. It was, like I said, it was something that I wished I'd done early in the presidential campaign and didn't. And what I found in Wisconsin was that fully a third of voters were cord cutters. And so from that, if you looked at that point, $20 million had been spent on TV ads. And I operated under the premise that a third of voters had seen none of those TV ads. So I took those data, that number, that 32% of the state being cord cutters, to an organization and said, hey, let's go target just these voters. And we had to be done digitally. And from that, you saw things turn around. The other point about the Cruz, Iowa experience, so even though we went on and lost later on, I take pride in that with all of those other polls. As was said, every final poll had Donald Trump winning, and many of them had Marco Rubio moving in front of Senator Cruz. The reason why our numbers were right is because we were sampling based on turnout scores. So hopefully this will switch through without playing again. You go ahead and take me to the next slide. Yep, thanks. So how does this work in in a situation where you don't have high quality voter data? And I went to Australia around August or so, was brought there by one of the parties. They pointed out it's actually illegal for a private citizen to own the voter file. And there's not a lot of public data that you can purchase due to privacy laws, some of the strictest in the world. So what we did there, and I had a theory that it would work, and ultimately we've now built a voter file, just cut to the end, is we synthesized thousands of publicly available census variables to build a model of the electorate. In some cases, it's down to the household level and not the individual level. But it's one in which we were able to capture distributions of all the demographics that matter, age, gender, income. We built a religiosity model that we overlaid it. We had a language model for there, a country of origin model. And so we utilized what's in Australia known as the S1 group that allowed the assignment of those variables to just create models of just a few hundred groups. So it's really more advanced than the Bush campaign would have had in 2004, probably not quite yet to where Obama was in 2008, but we'll get there. And that careful supplementation of existing data with synthesized public data is proven effective in terms of our ability to make a difference. And in our campaigns so far, it's made a difference that's allowed us to be successful. Another example is Ukraine, that we've recently done some work. And we've actually, if you went to the App Store, you could download, we've built a social media gamification app for a political party there. And the idea is it's very different than what I'm used to, where we have a winner-take-all system. The multi-party system, as I'm sure you guys are well aware, is it puts minority parties in a situation where they've got to make certain decisions as they run the campaign. And those parties that lose an election can still, of course, have a voice. So as such, we modified our approach to modeling for the purposes of helping our client there have a voice. So to begin crafting these models, and I leave you with this because I think this is useful as this could be applied between the Australia example and the Ukrainian example almost anywhere, is we captured a random sample of eligible voters using registration-based sampling. Just simply sampling from a voter file. We bought, rented, borrowed, whatever. So the actual universes we then created that allowed us to build the party's base of support and identify populations that helped them build a larger coalition. Then from there, we took those data and just the overall granularity in building models on top of models, we were able to help find voters that would support their coalition, and generated target universes that we then handed over to the local digital, television, direct mail, public relations, advertising teams for the purposes of going out and targeting. So these modeled universes then allowed the campaigns to target millions of individual voters that would not have crossed their path before. But more importantly, and I think this is a key point that's lost because you see these numbers, is if you have, let's just take a round number, 10 million potential voters, and through our modeling, we're able to identify 10% of that, 1 million, that are our key targets. Well, you've just saved 90% of your budget that can be reallocated and spent over and over. So I think it is, from a cost-benefit and an ROI standpoint, it has truly changed the way that our clients approach campaigns. And we'll have an overall difference in terms of the way that we continue to move forward. And the beauty of it is every time that a model is built, you're able to build on top of it, and you never start from scratch, which is also often the case. I'm sure you've all joined on with a campaign or an effort. So, well, yeah, we did this last time, but we kind of have to start over. I don't have any lists. I don't have any data. All of this continues to move and build upon itself. So, with that, I thank you. I appreciate your tolerance of me speaking in English, and hopefully I didn't go too fast. I tried to slow down. I am just a fast talker by nature, but I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Oh, thank you. Wow. Drink it all on the way home.